want to share a story with you this morning. So last week, it was kind of an unexpected that I was going to do a 2 weeks. I did not intend for the two of them to connect, but I think they do. And so I want to kind of recap a little bit about what I talked about last week if you were not here. And so last week, we kind of talked about the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And we were talking about, in the book of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are taken as prisoners of war by King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. And they are brought back to Babylon to work and serve under the king. And they are kind of trained in the customs and traditions and then brought into the service of the king. And Nebuchadnezzar, in this process, builds an idol. And he decrees that when the music plays, that everyone has to bow down and worship this idol. Now, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are obedient. They are obedient Israelites, and they are doing their best to honor God and to serve Him. And so one thing they're not going to do is bow down and worship another idol. And we talked about how they were pressured to be not only of the world, or not only in the world, but to also be of the world. And they refused to bow down, and they were threatened with fire. They still refused, and so King Nebuchadnezzar was good on his promise, and he threw them in the fiery furnace. And we talked about how we have a promise that the fire is coming, right? Like as followers and believers, we will be not only pressured to be disobedient and to be of the world and in the world, but we will also be promised and probably persecuted and tried by fire, because that is the reality of the enemy and his schemes. While they're in the fire, they are confident that God is able to protect them. King Nebuchadnezzar looks in and he sees that there's a fourth person in the fire. He recognizes him as the Son of God. He calls them out of the fire. They are unharmed. He bows down and he prays. And so we talked about, and he honors God and actually elevates them back to their position of authority. And so we talked about how we will have pressure. That we are promised to be tried by fire, but that we are also offered protection, and we are offered peace in the process, and that we are also offered a promotion, that God will, through that process, will elevate our faith, and He will elevate our responsibility, that as we prove to be more and more and more faithful and capable, and as we allow ourselves to be molded and shaped by the Holy Spirit, we will have greater and greater opportunities to serve Him. And I want to share another little story that kind of happened, I say 10 years ago. It could have actually, I didn't realize until first service when I was saying 10 years ago that it was actually 12 years ago, because we were pregnant with my daughter Natalie when it happened. So back up about 10 years ago, and I'm serving on staff as the youth and college and career pastor. I've been on staff for a while, but this ministry capstone that Bobby and I have birthed is starting to kind of grow, and we're getting to the point where we need a full-time person, and my wife and I are starting to feel this urgency that we're supposed to be pursuing that. I had been at a conference in Atlanta in early fall, and I really felt like the Lord was moving and beginning to confirm that, but we also were newly pregnant. I knew that Christmas was coming up, and so we were really kind of trying to discern if God was actually calling us to get out of the boat. It was going to be a pretty big leap of faith for a couple of reasons. One, I had a steady paycheck. I had a job that I loved doing, and it was consistent. And so there was a part of me that was going, gosh, it just does not make practical sense to walk away from that job. It does not make practical sense to do so while we're pregnant and Christmas is coming up. So, part of our ministry at Capstone had us working at Stonewall Jackson Juvenile Detention Center, and we were working with kids that were incarcerated there. And there was a gentleman that we would interact with when we would go down there. And this gentleman, he had called me on the phone here at the office and just said, "Hey, my wife and I would like to take you to lunch, and I'd like to hear a little bit more about the ministry that you're doing." And I thought, okay, that'd be great. We'll go and we'll talk about it. And in the back of my mind, I know that, Katie and I are still not settled on what we're going to do, because again, we're begging for a very, very clear sign. I wish I had the faith of some of you to go, oh, I know I heard, and I just go. But oftentimes I'm like, hey, I'm going to lay this thing out. If it's wet, then I might do it. If it's not, then I won't. You know, that kind of game that most of us play, right? I'm no different than most of us, and especially when it's hard, right? So I go to lunch with this couple, and we are sitting there having lunch, and it becomes apparent at the kind of midway through the lunch that while they are interested in what we're doing, there's kind of a motive behind it. The husband has spent most of his life working in a secular job, and in his retirement years, he would love an opportunity to work in ministry. That's kind of what he's doing. And so he wants to work either full-time or part-time in ministry. And so this is really more kind of him getting a feel for what our ministry is doing here and what we're doing there. And he doesn't really know about the whole capstone thing. He just thinks that you know, we're doing one thing. And so he's really kind of trying to feel me out to see if there's going to be a potential for a job for him when he retires. And so I began to realize that that's kind of what's going on. I mean, if I'm honest, I went into the lunch thinking that this was going to be a recruitment opportunity for me to get a volunteer or maybe somebody that's wanting to support what we were going to do. And I realized that that's not what their motivation behind it was. And so after they shared their heart and I kind of shared a little bit about the ministry, I just said, hey, in full disclosure, I just need to let you know I'm not sure what the next few months holds for me. And I began to explain to them that my wife and I were, prayerfully considering a new ministry that the Lord may be calling us into, and I shared with them, kind of our reluctance and just kind of what we were going through. The wife at that time kind of got this weird look on her face, and it was one of, at first I thought was confusion, but I began as I share this story with you, I began to realize that what it was confirmation. Like she came and sat down with some different pieces of the puzzle, and as this conversation starts to evolve, more and more things start to make sense to her. So she said, Lenny, I'd like to tell you a story. And I said, okay. She said, 20 years ago, my husband and I were part of a small group with 4 other couples. And we would meet weekly and do a Bible study. And we would pray and encourage and support one another. Very similar to what we do here on Wednesday nights. And she said, and over the course of a year, we began to realize that the Lord was stirring up in us this affection for and this desire to pray for a ministry that He was going to birth and that He was going to bring forth. And so we carved out a time in our study each week just to pray over that ministry and pray for one another and pray how we might be a part of what He's going to be doing. And she said, we did this for about a year. And she said, and at the end of that year, we felt led to do something. And she said, we felt led to each take $1 and place it in a jar and anoint that jar with oil and seal it. And when we did so, we knew that this was going to be seed money for a ministry that the Lord was blessing. And she said, so once we had done that, we would pray over that jar week after week, month after month, year after year. And she said, but over time, like a lot of things, you get busy and you move on to other things and you forget about things. And she said, and I really had forgotten all about that jar. But last night, before we came to this meeting, my husband and I were praying about what our part in this meeting was supposed to be. And she said, and we began to pray, Lord, we want to be a part of ministry. We want to be a part of what you're doing. We want to be a part of something new and exciting and growing. And she said, but if there's anything that we own or holding on to or a possession that we have that we need to let go of, we're asking that you reveal that to us. And she said, and after we prayed and said amen, my husband went into the living room and I began to clean out our storage closet. And she said, in the back bottom corner of our storage closet, she said, I found a box. And she said, I looked inside that box and I found that jar. And as she's telling me this, she reaches down into her pocketbook and she pulls out this jar. She sets it on the table. And she said, I want to ask you a question. She said, do you believe in the gifts of the Spirit? Now, that's a loaded question. I've been around Christendom enough to know that when somebody asks you that, there's a whole lot of ways that conversation can go. So I thought, well, let me ask a little bit further what she means. I said, by gifts of the Spirit, what do you mean? And she said, gifts of the Spirit, things like prophecy, healing, tongues, things like that. And so I'm thinking, okay, this conversation could get really weird depending on how I answer this, but I'm going, I can't deny, yes. I said, yes, ma'am, I do. I said, I've seen God move in incredible ways. And I have seen God bring healing. I have seen God bring revelation. And I have seen God reveal in the now his plans for the future. And she said, good. She said, because this is going to be a prophetic watershed moment for you. She said, as clearly as I've ever heard anything in my life, when I found this jar, the Lord told me that I'm supposed to bring this jar to lunch today. And she said, and as we've been sitting here talking, he told me that I'm to take this jar out and I'm to hand you this jar. And I'm to tell you that this is seed money for the ministry and the work that he's calling you to. That long before you ever had a vision, a plan, an understanding, long before any of those things, he had anointed every resource that you would ever need to fulfill what he's calling you to. Now that was a defining watershed moment for me. That was a God-answered prayer. I mean, I could not wait to get on the phone with my wife after I left that and share that story with her. And so we brought this jar home, and I told Katie the story, and we began to pray. If you got your Bibles, I'd ask that you would turn into 2 Kings chapter 4, verse 1 through 7. It's going to be up on the screen if you don't have your Bibles, but 2 Kings 4, verse 1 through 7. Now the wife of a man from the company of the prophets cried out to Elisha, your servant, my husband, is dead, and you know that he revered the Lord. But now his creditors are coming to take my 2 boys as slaves. Elisha replied to her, how can I help you? Tell me, what do you have in the house? Your servant has nothing there at all, she said, except a small jar of olive oil. That noise just reminded me of something, sorry. Squirrel. Elisha said, go around and ask all of your neighbors for empty jars. Don't ask for just a few. Then go inside and shut the door behind you and your sons. Pour the oil into all the jars, and as each one is filled, put it aside. She left him, shut the door behind her and her sons. And they brought the jars to her, and she kept pouring. When all their jars were full, she said to her sons, bring me another jar. But he replied, there's not a jar left. And then the oil stopped flowing. She went and told the man of God, and he said, go and sell the oil and pay your debts, and you and your sons can live on what is left. Last week, I gave you 5 P's. I'm going to give you 5 more. The first one we've already talked about. For this to make sense, I'm going to start with the fact that we serve a God who is prophetically speaking to what he is doing. That he is not leaving us in the dark. He has spoken and continues to speak. The first P after prophecy is purpose. If you've never heard this, I want to be the first to share with you that God has a purpose for everything that he does. No matter what is going on in our lives, he has a purpose. God created you and I for a purpose, with a purpose in mind when he did so. I would love for you and I to take comfort in the fact that the creator of the universe has a purpose for everything that he has done and continues to do. That from the beginning of time, he has been prophetically speaking to what is coming. He has been revealing himself. Genesis 1:28, God blessed him and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the seas, the birds in the sky, and over every living creature that moves on the ground." There are 4 commands in there that reveal God's purpose. He intended for you and I to be fruitful. He intended for you and I to multiply. He intended for you and I to fill the earth and to rule over it. You were created for a purpose. Oftentimes we take fruitful and multiply and we think it means the same thing, but it doesn't. Fruitful, to produce, to bear, to bring forth life, to bring forth hope, to bring forth joy. That God has purposed you for the work that he created you to do. God has a purpose for you. I think about this jar and I think about how long before I ever had a vision, he already had a purpose for me. He was already leveraging resources and opportunities, because in order for his purpose to be revealed, you got to have a plan. Now, if you work in the business world, this ought to make sense to you, right? Because most organizations have a purpose statement, a vision statement, and a mission statement. The purpose statement is why the organization exists. And then the mission is its plan to accomplish its purpose. So God has a purpose. There is a reason that you exist. There's a reason that you exist, and there's a reason that you exist now. God didn't accidentally place you in this time in history. He put you here for a purpose. And he has a plan for you to be here in this time for this purpose. He has a plan for your life. Before I ever had a vision of ministry, he had a plan. Listen, I did the math, and I was probably 20 years old when this jar was anointed. Actually, I might have even been 18. Should have told y'all I was 3, but that wasn't the case. I might have been 18, around 18 years old when this money was anointed. At 18 years old, I was consumed by 2 things: perfume and car fumes. There was very little evidence, other than the fact that I was raised in a Christian home, there was very little evidence that I was pursuing any plan or purpose that God had for me. In fact, if you would have been hanging around me at 18 and 20 years old, you would have probably heard very little about Jesus unless I was taking his name in vain. I surely wasn't sitting around contemplating the plans that he had for me. I wasn't sitting around pondering my purpose. But God was ordaining and prophesying to the ministry that I was being called to. Jeremiah 29:11. Most of you know it. Most of you can quote it. For I know the plans that I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you, not to harm you. Plans to give you a hope and a future. God, I know the plans I have for you, he says. God has created you for a purpose, and he has a plan for your life. The next thing is persistence. God has purposed you. He has a plan, and he is persistent. For 20 years, this jar has sat in a closet. It did not occur to me until a few years ago when I was going to give this talk at a different place, and I was trying to find the jar. I'll explain in a minute, and I couldn't find it. It didn't occur to me what that woman said about how they prayed over this and they got busy and over time, because when she first gave me this jar, I took this jar and my wife and I set it on our mantle. And every day it served as a visual reminder of the promise that we had. That God had a purpose, he had a plan, and that he had promised that he had ordained every resource that we would need. But like many of us, we get busy and we moved houses and things like that. And over time, the jar just got put away. I didn't even realize it was missing until I couldn't find it. And then I got nervous that it had been stolen. And so we spent a couple of days looking for it. And the Lord gently reminded me, whether you can see it or not, my purpose and my plan hasn't changed for you. Nobody can steal the purpose and the plan that I have for you. Nobody can change it, hide it, take it, destroy it. I have a plan and a purpose for you. Tracy quoted it during the worship set. I thought it was amazing when she did it first service because it was totally unplanned and unscripted. Here's an example of God's persistence. For your eyes saw my unformed body. All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be. How precious are your thoughts to me. How vast the sum of them. Were I to count them, they would outnumber the grains of sand. God knew you before your body was formed. He knitted you together in your mother's womb. You were fearfully and wonderfully made. His thoughts for you outnumber the grains of sand. He's so committed to the purpose and the plans that he has for you that he pursued you all the way to the cross. And that he willingly took your place so that you could fulfill the purpose and the plans that he had for you. Because he's persistent. God has a purpose, he has a plan, and he's persistent. And when you and I have the right perspective, we will come to realize that. The last thing I want to talk to you about is perspective. the lady gives me this jar. She and her husband pray for my wife and I. My wife and I take this and we place it in our home and we use it as a reminder of God's faithfulness. And we step out of the boat and we pursue him. And 2 years into our ministry, it has been a roller coaster, to say the least. In fact, I said this during first service. Before I even got up here to speak, I was just kind of thinking about all the ups and downs of pursuing that ministry, and some of those down times are some of the darkest, fiery moments of my life. In fact, I found myself during worship in the first service having this visceral reaction as I was thinking through some of the heartbreak that we had to walk through during that time. And so a couple years into the ministry, I'm on the verge of giving up. And so a mentor of mine, I asked to go to lunch, and I said, I just want to share what's on my heart. And so we sit down and we have lunch, and he says, okay, tell me, what's going on? And I shared with him everything that we've been walking through, and I talked about how month after month after month, we only have enough to get by. That we at times are just going paycheck to paycheck. That as the month starts to get to an end, I'm wondering if I'm going to be able to make payroll, and there always seems to be more month than there is money. And it's exhausting. It's exhausting to, write those payroll checks thinking I'm only going to have pennies in the bank, and then, at the last minute somebody comes through, it's just this cycle. And it's just, and at times it felt like wave after wave after wave. And I said, man, this has been going on for several years now. And I said, I'm just tired. I'm tired of praying. I'm tired of waiting. And I said, I just need somebody to lament to, and I need somebody to encourage me. And so, do you have any words? And he looks at me with tears in his eyes, and he goes, that is the dumbest thing I've ever heard you say in my life. He's like, I don't know how else to say that. And he said, other than the fact that if you can't see what you just said, I don't know how to change your perspective. And so he says, turn to 2 Kings 4. And so I did. And we read this passage together. And he said, as long as there were jars, there was oil. As long as there was a need, there was a provision. It wasn't until the need or the purpose or the plan had been fulfilled that the oil stopped flowing. He said, you have in your possession the tangible promise of God's faithfulness. And you're sitting here telling me that you only have a month's worth of resources? It sounds to me like you've always had a month's worth of resources. And he said, what if you changed that one word, instead of saying I only to I always? He said, how would that frame God's plans and purposes? How would that frame your thoughts on provision and your attitude towards what he's called you to do? As the band comes up, I'll close with a couple of thoughts. See, you and I, we're created for a purpose. God has a plan, and he's persistent, but you and I are responsible for the perspective of how we approach that. See, the children of Israel got in trouble because they always had their daily bread. But at some point they began to doubt that, and they started collecting extra bread. And what happened is it would rot and it would mold, because God was trying to teach them to focus on his provision and his plans and his promises, and to walk in obedience and confidence that if he says yes, then it's yes. If he says he will, then he will. If he says I am, he means what he says. And when you and I start to try to control things and change our perspective on the faithfulness of God, oftentimes we lose sight of purpose, we lose sight of plan, and we lose sight of his persistence. So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but what is unseen. Since what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. I don't know what struggles you're going through. I don't know what doubts you have. I don't know where you're struggling and what your perspective is on your marriage, on your family, on other relationships, on your career. I don't know what revelation you're waiting for. I don't know what breakthrough you're waiting for. But I pray that your perspective is that God always What if Moses would have stopped after Pharaoh said no? Would the children of Israel seen the promised land? What if Joseph would have given up hope when his brothers sold him into slavery, or when he was in prison? Would he have been promoted and elevated to a place where he could not only save his family, but his people? What if Peter, after denying Jesus, would have walked away in shame and never allowed himself to be redeemed? Would he have still been the rock? What if Paul, in the midst of all of his persecution, would have abandoned the faith? Would we have the letters to the church? What if Christ would have allowed the cup to pass him? Would you and I have eternity to stand righteous before a holy God, restored and redeemed? I close with this prayer for you and I. Proverbs 30:7. Two things I ask you, Lord. Do not refuse me before I die. Keep falsehood and lies far from me. Give me neither poverty nor riches, but give me only my daily bread. Otherwise, I may have too much and disown you and say, who is the Lord? Or I may become poor and steal and so dishonor the name of God. May you and I rest knowing that our provision, our daily bread is found in the faithfulness of God, who always fulfills the purpose and the plans that he has for us, and will pursue us all the way to the grave. Be blessed.